All right, Ted, how long have you been in the funeral industry?
I started when I was 16 years old, working for a local funeral home, just washing cars in the garage and doing some basic maintenance. And I'm 63 years old now, so if we do the math, it's probably close to 45 some years that I've been involved in the profession. Licensed, I went to mortuary school in the early 1980s and got a funeral director's license in 81 to 82.
So what is the difference between a funeral director, undertaker, and mortician?
It's more semantics nowadays. In Pennsylvania, you have a funeral director's license, which also includes what's called an embalmer's license. In other states, you have to have a separate license, be it a funeral director or embalmer and or both. The terminology as far as undertaker, mortician, and funeral director, it's just a matter of what was accepted at different times. Early on in some countries, the European countries, we were called undertakers. In the United States, it's either mortician or funeral director.
What made you want to become a funeral director?
Again, as I mentioned, I started just working at a funeral home, a neighborhood funeral home, washing cars when I was 16, 17 years old. And as I progressed and stayed there a little bit longer, I saw what was happening with different families and how the funeral director was treating those families. And I thought I would certainly like to help out families in a time of grief. And I decided to become a funeral director.
Why are funerary practices important, and do they really help the mourning process?
We call it the grief process, and yes, there is a big thing. Many people say, oh, why do we need a funeral? And it's just, we don't like to be looked at or gawked at. I've heard people say that. But you have to understand the grief process, and we need a place to go to remember that person, and you want to see that person sometimes in a better state than they may have been as they were passing away or dying. As far as the grief process, again, everyone goes through that in a different way. Not only does a family member or the family of the deceased need to go through that grief process, so does the community or the town or the situation where that person lived. When we had the COVID situation over the past few years, I often say that sometimes you don't realize you've lost something until it's gone. And when all the sanctions were on with COVID, we and family members in the community could not experience that grief. And now we can. So with the sanctions being lifted, again, I think people now have realized what they've lost. And not only does the immediate family have to go through that grief, but our community in general needs to go through that grief and share it with each other. The family needs to be able to share that grief with the community and get that support from the community the family needs, and now we're able to do that again.
Do you provide resources for the grieving families?
We don't necessarily ourselves here, because to be able to do that you need to have a grief counselor, and we don't have one, but we do have resources in the area that we send people to. And if I see a family going through a very difficult time, and even if they're not, we have some local churches and local facilities in the area that we certainly refer families to.
That being said, how does being a funeral director affect your personal and home life?
Being a funeral director in this area, a lot of local funeral homes are family owned. They don't have a big staff where they can take time off and deal with different things. Yes, I've missed holidays, I've missed birthdays, I've missed a lot of events in my own family because we need to be here to take care of the families we service. So you have to deal with that as a local funeral home in this area. Again, if it's a big business, a big funeral business with a lot of people on the staff, you can get time off. But being a small funeral home in this area, being just us, yeah, I do miss a lot of holidays.
Well, how is the emotional part of being a funeral director? How does that affect you?
And I hate to have to say this, but we have to turn it off. We have to help a family through their own grief, through their own funeral service for their family member. Yes, we do grieve, and I will try to vent that with my wife and friends and family that I have. But to deal with that grief at that time with that family, it sounds cold, but sometimes we have to turn that emotion off until we've taken care of that family.
What are the physical aspects of being a funeral director then?
Other than the obvious of having to lift a person when they've passed, and if they're a bigger person, we have to deal with that on our own. A lot of times we've heard an old story that when you get your funeral director's license, you also better find a chiropractor to help with the back pains. So other than that.
Well, aren't you afraid of working with those harmful chemicals?
Well, we do have protective gear that we have to and required to wear. Yes, some of the chemicals we use in the embalming are carcinogens, and we certainly have to deal with that. We have devices throughout our what's called our preparation room that measures the air content and how much is in the air of the embalming chemicals. So yes, we have the protective gear and the devices to take care of that.
What is the one question you get asked the most about being a funeral director?
Oh, we get a lot of questions, but the one I get most is how do you do this, or how are you able to do this day in and day out? Yes, it's a profession, it's an industry, but I call it a calling, quite honestly. And I've interviewed some people that wanted to work at the funeral home or become funeral directors, and I've said to them, listen, in this area, you've got to really want to do this and service families. And again, it's I don't want to say it's hard work, but it can be difficult sometimes, and you lose a lot in your own personal family life. But I consider this a calling, and when I get that reward of a family saying to me, we couldn't have got through this without you, that in and of itself makes me go on and on.
So a lot of people say it's the small details that you really notice in things, and so how much personalization can you get for a funeral service?
I myself personally like to do a lot of personalization of that person's life. What we do here at our facility is we do video tributes, or what are called picture boards, and pictures and mementos of that person. Could be put in the casket or in the area. We do something that we just started doing now at our facility. We have a small table that we put on the front porch at the entrance of our funeral home. And we just had a service just a little while ago for a gentleman who was a model train enthusiast. And what we did is, and I myself have some trains, and what I did is I took one of our trains, and it was continuously running on the front porch for that gentleman's viewing and his funeral. We also have a lady that we just did a service for who was a nurse, and we put a nurse's cap on that front table, and she also loved her dog, and we have a footprint of a dog from my own dog that passed, and we put that out there for her. And God love her, she was also a truck driver, and we put a small model of a truck on that front table. So again, that's the personalization we try to do here. Floral tributes can be personalized. We do that also, and caskets or urns, we could do that also. We had a lady who was a memorial service with a cremation with an urn, and she liked butterflies, and that butterfly was etched into the outside of that urn. We also do a candle ceremony here at the Disc Funeral Home. We alluded to that a little bit on our earlier video. At the end of the year, we try to remember everyone that passed away in that particular year with the candlelight service, and we have light bulbs on a tree out front that we light in memory of each individual that we had for that service that particular year. Casket companies are also doing more and more personalization. They can put panels in the back of the casket, be it if the person was a veteran or something like that. So there are more personalizations that I like myself, and that now the casket manufacturers are also starting to take light of.
So speaking of caskets, how do people choose the casket or urn that they want, and what if they don't want any that are in the display room here?
So the previous question answered some of that as far as personalization. When people come in here in our facility to select the casket, most times it's the color of the casket, or sometimes the back panel of the particular casket that a family will look at and like. Something that casket companies have started to do over the past few years, we don't have a lot of room here to carry all the caskets manufactured. So what the different casket companies are doing now is they have pictures in a particular casket, and the casket will come in many different colors, but for the same prices that happens to be in that particular casket. If a family comes in and they don't see something they like in our display room, we certainly have pictures and pamphlets and books that the casket companies put out, and it makes the selection much greater.
So in the casket display room, I noticed that there's a display in the one corner that says burial vaults. So what are those?
As far as the products, we're going to cover that in other videos talking about histories and funeral merchandise and the practices, which includes the differences between a casket and a coffin, or a vault versus a liner, and there is a difference with that. Mausoleum and crypts, and even jewelry that could be personalized. So that's something we're going to be touching on in probably future videos.
So being a funeral director can pretty much be stressful sometimes. So stress spelled backwards is desserts. So what is your favorite dessert?
My favorite dessert, and my wife knows I'm going to answer this real quick, is tiramisu. I tried that many years ago, and every time we go to a restaurant and the waiter or waitress will come over and say, what do you have for dessert? I just look at my wife and she'll say, he's going to have the tiramisu.
All right, well that's all. Thank you for answering the questions, and we'll see you guys for the next video.
You're quite welcome.